Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to be speaking in English. My name is Evgenia. I also go by Zhenya or Jane, whichever, all of those are fine. And so I'm going to be talking today about activism and family dynamics. I am a social anthropologist at the University of St. Andrews, and I've been doing my doctoral research with 3 Russian anti-organizations in London. Those were rather small-scale grassroots organizations, mostly with Russians who came to the UK before the start of the full-scale invasion, so have already been here for a while, and who, with the start of the full-scale invasion, realized that they want to express themselves in relation to this, they want to do something about it. They started organizing protests, fundraisers, things like that. And so I am an anthropologist of activism and a political anthropologist. I am not a specialist in families, but the way that anthropological research works is that you are doing very in-depth work with people for at least a year. Well, that's how it works in the UK at the very least. It's a little bit different in Eastern Europe. And whether you want to or not, family, of course, is such an important part of life. It comes up. So I'm not going to be presenting results of a research that was done specifically on family, but I'm going to be talking about how family ties for Russian activists have been affected by the full-scale invasion, and kind of just a couple of interesting bits and bobs that I've observed. Maybe some of them will resonate with you, maybe they won't, but luckily you only have to listen to me for 15 minutes. And, okay, so let's start. And I'm going to first talk about gender, because this was something very interesting that I've noticed during my research and quite often was an entryway to talking about family. So with the 3 organizations that I worked with, they were predominantly staffed by women or by non-binary people who were socialized as women when they were children. And it was extremely noticeable. I would say 90% of all members of anti-organizations were women. And this is not a particularly unique situation. It tends to happen with grassroots activist organizations that are centered on provision of care and on creation of community, especially like grassroots, like horizontal organizations where there is no particular leadership or particular political ambitions. And for example, there was a researcher, Julie Hammond, who did a study of gender intervention programs in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s. So this was the period when a lot of Western institutions were coming to the newly liberated Russia and telling them, we're going to teach you about gender equality, and we're going to give you some gender equality programs. How do you make that happen? And so there was a lot of money in that sphere, and grassroots organizations there were mostly staffed by women as well. To which you might think, well, it's like gender equality, gender interventions, of course women were more interested in that than men. However, the interesting part in that was that as soon as we start looking, even within those gender intervention programs, at programs with more positions of responsibility, like organizers of workshops, people who are distributing grants and things like that, we start seeing more men. So it's only a particular characteristic of grassroots organizations. The higher we go up, the more horizontal the organization is, the higher we look at the level of organization, the more men we start to see. That's, once again, quite common for activism in Russia and in the UK as well. But, it's one thing to talk about gender, but let's kind of return this back to the topic of family. The interesting thing here as well was that most women who were in anti-organizations had Russian partners. Most of them were married before they migrated. Some of them even, I think, met each other during migration, but most of them had partners who were also Russian. And I found myself in the same conversation multiple times, to the point that it became very noticeable to me that I would be interviewing a female activist, asking what it means for them to be an activist, and they'd say, well, this is my civic duty, this is my responsibility. I feel like all Russians who have left the country have the responsibilities to speak up, because those who stayed in the country do not have responsibility to speak up. And I would say, great, that's amazing, and what about your husband? And interestingly, that would be followed by a big pause. And I would realize that this is not something they've thought about. And they would start on the spot. You could really see, like, the wheels turning and coming on the spot with explanation. Well, my husband, he's not really interested in that. It's not really his atmosphere. I don't know why he's not participating. I don't know. And that led me to think about the fact that the goals, the aims, and the values that we experience in different spheres of our lives can be very different. So, in activism, we might think that a particular set of characteristics, of values, of commitments is desirable. In family, we might think that a completely different set of values is desirable from our partner. And I think probably this is something that a lot of you can relate. If you think, for example, that you might have certain personal characteristics that you think make you a great wife, or make you a great son, or make you a great sibling. However, let's say you might think that when you're talking about the context of work, the same qualities might become problematic. Like being a little bit too empathetic and a little bit too trusting to people is a great thing in family, but it might not be so great in other contexts. And so clearly activists had different ideas what it means to be a good activist and what it means to be a good partner, for example. And it's not necessarily a problem. We are very multifaceted beings, all of us, and rarely do we have the same values across all roles that we have in our life. But this kind of led me to consider a couple of things. That first of all, Russian activism, Russian anti-war activism is not family-based. Quite often it's just one family member who is participating in it. Rarely is the whole family involved. And second is that, the relationship between family and activism can be quite complex, and sometimes even invisibly so. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to actually focus on a slightly different sphere. I'm going to talk about intergenerational relationships to kind of further illustrate those points and draw a couple of conclusions at the very end. So, intergenerational relationships. So, it would be no surprise to anyone that Russian people who participate in anti-war activism usually have troubles with going home, especially if they participate in activism in the open. They kind of they make a decision that it means they're not going back to Russia in the foreseeable future, and they don't know when they might go. And this, of course, has a strong impact on intergenerational relationships. So, first of all, there are activists who have kids, who live in my case, who live in the UK, and they have children here. And what I've noticed is that even if they don't participate in activism in the open, they still will be extremely hesitant about even thinking of going to Russia. There were some activists who were sometimes toying with the idea or thinking like, well, I didn't speak at public events, I probably can go. And some people would do this, they would take this risk and occasionally go to Russia for a few days. However, activists who had kids never did that. And this was a very noticeable thing. And as one of the activists explained this to me, honey is sweet, but the bee stings. I want to take my kids to Russia to see the family. I want them to have a connection with their motherland. But I imagine this picture. I'm trying to cross the border with my kids at an airport in Russia, and their mom is arrested in front of their eyes. And I cannot put them through such trauma. So on the one hand, there is responsibility to your kids to, not be arrested and be present in their life. However, on the other hand, this still has a very strong negative impact on intergenerational relationships because you have troubles passing down culture to your children. They grow up in a different country, they cannot see their grandparents, they cannot see places where you grew up. In particular, one activist told me she was from Republic of Sakha, which is, for those of you who don't know, is like the biggest republic in Russia. And she was a native Saha person, meaning she looks Asian. And she had a child with her Saha husband, who also looked very Asian and who went to school here. And one day, this child came back home around February time and said, "Mom, why are we not celebrating Chinese New Year? Because all the Chinese kids at our school are saying that this is a big holiday, and I look like them, so what's up with that?" And she told me that she frantically took out all the national clothes, all the national accessories, started showing pictures, and so she realized that she completely missed that point at which her child started losing that connection. So yes, and on the other hand, there is a relationship with older generation, and this is something that Lyubov Friedrichovna also talked about, that quite a few of the people that I worked with said that it was a very difficult trade-off between being an activist and knowing that you would not be able to see your grandparents or parents again, potentially. And quite a few activists, even in the course of my research, have lost family members in Russia, and it was very difficult for them. So, on the preliminary basis, we can say that our goals, values, and ties in activism and in family may not always align. We might have different expectations from our family members and different expectations from fellow activists, and that activists may come at the cost of meaningful family ties, especially intergenerational ties. So it kind of paints this picture where there is activism on one hand and family on the other hand, and they are in conflict, and you have to sacrifice one for the other, especially considering that activism also takes time if you participate in it over a number of years. But I think this is only part of this picture, because on the other hand, I once spoke to an activist who had kids about what drove her to become more politically active. And she said that it was having kids that made her realize that she needs to do something about the world. And she explained to me that she had this very neoliberal idea of, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. The government does what it wants, but you have to stay strong, and it all depends on you and no one else. But then when she had kids, she suddenly got very scared of the world that she was going to leave them in. And she realized that she really wants to do something about that, to leave them at a better place in life. And so, on the other hand, we can say that through responsibility for society at large that people express through activism, activism can also be a form of responsibility for the future of the family. So not only are you trying to make things better for the world, you're also trying to make things better for the world in which your children will have to be. I have to say that with Russian anti-war activism, this is still pretty much a marginal position, because not only most activists were women, most activists were also women without children, which of course, if you have family, probably participating in formal activism becomes a little bit more challenging, so fewer people did that. And quite often the decision to participate in activism was grounded in the sense of individual moral responsibility. I believe that this is right, I think this is my duty. I want in the future to be able to say that I was against this. However, as more activists are starting to have children, as their children are growing up, we can potentially see in the future that this field is also going to change, and we will see more of an importance of considerations for family in Russian anti-war activism. So that's all that I have for you today, and thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have them. Thank you.